name is Jim, and this happened 3 years ago during Memorial Day weekend. My wife Carol and I had been living in our suburban neighborhood for about 8 years at that point. It's one of those places where everyone knows each other. Kids ride their bikes in the street, and people actually wave when they see you. The kind of neighborhood where you feel safe leaving your doors unlocked, at least during the day. Our next-door neighbor, Bill, was this quiet guy in his 60s who lived alone after his wife passed away a few years back. He was the type who kept to himself, but was always friendly when you ran into him. He'd wave from his garden, help carrying groceries if he saw you struggling, that sort of thing. Bill had this routine where every morning at exactly 7:30, he'd walk out to get his newspaper and check his mailbox. You could set your watch by it. That Memorial Day weekend, Carol and I decided to throw a barbecue. Nothing huge, just some friends from work, a few neighbors, maybe 20 people total. We'd been planning it for weeks. Carol loves hosting, and I love grilling, so it seemed like the perfect way to kick off summer. We sent out invitations, bought way too much food, and spent the Saturday before cleaning the backyard and setting up tables. The weather that Monday was perfect. Not too hot, not too humid. Just that ideal late spring temperature where you want to spend the entire day outside. We started prepping around noon, and by 2 p.m., people were starting to arrive. The music was playing, kids were running around, and I was manning the grill like some suburban warrior. Everything felt exactly like it should. But there was something nagging at me that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It took me a while to realize what it was. I hadn't seen Bill all weekend, not Saturday, not Sunday, and not that morning either. His newspaper was still sitting in his driveway, along with what looked like 2 or 3 previous days' worth of mail stuffed in his mailbox. For a guy as routine-oriented as Bill, that was completely out of character. I mentioned it to Carol while she was setting out the potato salad. Carol said, maybe he went to visit family for the holiday, but something about the way his house looked bothered me. The blinds were all closed, which wasn't unusual, but there was this stillness to the place that felt wrong, like it had been empty for days. Around 4 p.m., the party was in full swing. I had ribs on the grill, kids were playing cornhole, and someone had brought out a speaker that was pumping music loud enough for the whole block to hear. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a sound coming from somewhere nearby that didn't fit with the party atmosphere. It was faint, barely audible over the music and conversation, but it sounded like tapping. At first, I thought it was someone doing construction work, maybe a neighbor fixing a fence or something. But the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't random hammering. It was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like Morse code. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause, and it seemed to be coming from the ground. I walked to the edge of our backyard, near the property line between our house and Bill's. The tapping was definitely louder there, and it definitely seemed to be coming from underground. I crouched down and pressed my ear to the grass, feeling ridiculous but unable to ignore what I was hearing. The sound was clearer now, more urgent, and between the tapping, I could swear I heard something else, something that sounded like muffled shouting. Carol noticed me kneeling in the grass and walked over. She asked, "What are you doing?" I told her to listen, but by the time she got there, the tapping had stopped. The shouting, if that's what it was, had stopped too. She looked at me like I was losing my mind, and honestly, I was starting to wonder the same thing. But then it started again. This time, Carol heard it too. Her face went pale and she grabbed my arm. She whispered, "Jim, that sounds like someone screaming." The tapping resumed, more frantic now, and there was no mistaking the human voice underneath it. Someone was underground and they were trying to get out. I told Carol to call 911 while I tried to figure out exactly where the sound was coming from. I moved around Bill's backyard, following the noise, and realized it was loudest near a section of ground that looked recently disturbed. The grass was newer, a slightly different shade of green, and the soil underneath felt softer when I stepped on it. By this point, our party guests had noticed that something was wrong. A few of them came over to see what was happening, and when they heard the tapping and muffled screaming, everyone went silent. Someone turned off the music, and in that sudden quiet, the sounds from underground became crystal clear. It was definitely a human voice, hoarse and desperate, shouting for help. The police arrived within minutes, along with the fire department and paramedics. They took one look at the disturbed earth and immediately called for excavation equipment. While we waited, one of the officers asked me about Bill, and I told him about the uncollected newspapers and mail. The officer's expression darkened and he radioed for additional units. It took about an hour to dig down to whatever was buried there. By that time, the tapping had stopped, and so had the shouting. The silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. I stood there with Carol and about half our neighborhood, watching as the excavator pulled up chunk after chunk of dark soil. When they finally reached what they were looking for, I wish I could unsee it. It was a makeshift wooden box, barely big enough for a person, with air holes drilled in the top. They pulled it up carefully, and when they pried off the lid, Bill was inside. He was unconscious but alive, barely. His fingernails were bloody from clawing at the wood, and his voice was completely gone from screaming. The paramedics worked on him right there in his backyard, while the police cordoned off the area as a crime scene. Bill was rushed to the hospital, and thankfully, he survived. But the story of how he ended up buried alive in his own backyard was something that still gives me nightmares. According to what the police told us later, Bill had been approached on Friday by someone claiming to be from a landscaping company. The guy said he was doing work for the city and needed to check Bill's property for some kind of utility line. Bill, being trusting and polite, let the man into his backyard. That's when the man attacked him, knocked him unconscious, and buried him alive in a pre-dug hole. The police found evidence that the perpetrator had been planning this for weeks. He'd been watching Bill's routine, knew exactly when he'd be alone, and had prepared the burial site in advance. The timing wasn't coincidental either. He'd chosen Memorial Day weekend specifically because he knew the neighborhood would be loud with parties and celebrations. The noise from our barbecue, and probably others throughout the area, had been masking Bill's cries for help for 3 days. They never caught the guy. Despite having some physical evidence and a general description from Bill, the investigation went cold. The police think it might have been connected to a series of similar attacks in other states, but nothing was ever proven. Bill moved away about 6 months later. He said he couldn't sleep in that house anymore, knowing he'd been buried alive just feet from his back door. As for Carol and me, we never had another Memorial Day barbecue. Every time I think about that day, I remember the sound of Bill's desperate tapping coming up through the earth, and how close we came to never hearing it at all. If our party had been just a little bit louder, or if I hadn't been standing in exactly the right spot, at exactly the right time, Bill would have died down there. The thought of that keeps me awake some nights, even now. My name is Lucas, and I'm a veteran of the Iraq War. I served 2 tours between 2004 and 2007 with the 173rd Airborne Brigade. This story happened 2 years ago during a Memorial Day ceremony in my hometown of Riverside, California. It's something I've never talked about publicly before, but after what happened, I think people need to know. Every year since I got back, I've made it a point to attend the local Memorial Day service at Riverside National Cemetery. It's not something I particularly enjoy, to be honest. There's a lot of complicated feelings that come with surviving when others didn't. But I go anyway, partly out of respect for the guys who didn't make it home, and partly because it feels like something I'm supposed to do. The ceremony that year was larger than usual. There had to be several hundred people there, a mix of veterans from different eras, active duty military, and families of the fallen. I usually keep to myself at these things, show up, pay my respects, and leave quietly. I'm not great with crowds, and being around a lot of other veterans can sometimes trigger memories I'd rather keep buried. About halfway through the ceremony, during the playing of taps, I noticed a guy standing near the back of the crowd who kept looking in my direction. He was wearing a dress uniform with the same unit patches I'd worn overseas, 173rd Airborne. That caught my attention because it's not a huge unit, and I thought I'd recognize anyone from my deployment who lived in the area. After the ceremony ended, the guy approached me. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with short brown hair and the kind of build that suggested he kept himself in military shape. He stuck out his hand and said, "Lucas, right? I think we served together. Staff Sergeant Tony Mitchell." The name didn't ring a bell, but that wasn't unusual. There were a lot of people who rotated through our unit during my time there, and the memory can be unreliable when it comes to faces and names. Tony seemed friendly enough, and he knew details about our deployment that convinced me he'd been there. He mentioned specific FOBs we'd operated out of, the names of guys in our unit, even some of the missions we'd run. When he suggested we grab a beer and catch up, I agreed. It felt good to talk to someone who understood what that deployment had been like. We went to a sports bar near the cemetery, and for the first hour or so, everything seemed normal. Tony had stories that lined up with my memories, and he seemed genuinely interested in hearing about what I'd been up to since getting out. But as the conversation went on, I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. For one thing, Tony kept asking specific questions about other guys from our unit, where they lived now, what they were doing, whether I'd kept in touch with any of them. At first, I thought he was just trying to reconnect with old friends, but there was something about the way he asked that felt off, too focused, too detailed. Then he started bringing up missions and incidents that I didn't remember the same way he did. Small details, but important ones. He described an IED attack that I distinctly remembered happening on a different day than he claimed. He mentioned casualties from a firefight that I was certain had occurred during a different operation entirely. The thing that really set off alarm bells was when he started talking about Mike Santos, one of our machine gunners who'd been killed by a sniper in Kirkuk. Tony claimed that he'd been there when it happened, that he'd helped carry Mike to the medevac chopper, but I knew for a fact that Tony hadn't been on that patrol. I remembered exactly who had been there because it was one of the worst days of my deployment. Mike had been a close friend, and every detail of that day was burned into my memory. I called Tony out on it, politely at first. I said, "I think you might be mixing up some details. You weren't on the patrol when Mike got hit. But Tony insisted he was right, got almost aggressive about it. He said, "Trust me, Lucas, I was there. I carried him myself." That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I excused myself to go to the bathroom, but really, I wanted a moment to think. In the bathroom, I pulled out my phone and did something I probably should have done earlier. I looked up Tony Mitchell on social media, tried to find any record of him serving with the 173rd. What I found made my blood run cold. There was a Tony Mitchell who had served with the 173rd Airborne, but he'd been killed in Afghanistan in 2008. The real Tony Mitchell was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Whoever I was sitting with at that bar was using a dead soldier's identity. I stayed in the bathroom for a few more minutes, trying to figure out what to do. My first instinct was to confront the guy, but something told me that would be a mistake. If he was impersonating a dead soldier, there had to be a reason, and I didn't think it was a good one. When I came back to the table, I tried to act normal while I figured out how to get out of there safely. But the fake Tony seemed to sense that something had changed. He kept studying my face, and his questions became more pointed. He asked, "You keep in touch with David Kim? I heard he's living in Phoenix now." David Kim had been our squad leader, and yes, he was living in Phoenix. The fact that this imposter knew that information scared the hell out of me. I told Tony I needed to leave, made up some excuse about having dinner plans with my girlfriend. But when I stood up to go, he grabbed my wrist. His grip was strong, and his expression had changed completely. He said, "Sit back down, Lucas. We're not done talking." There was something in his voice that made it clear this wasn't a request. I sat back down, but I was already planning my exit. The bar was crowded, and I figured if things went bad, I could make enough noise to get help. Tony leaned across the table and said, "I need you to understand something. David Kim and Mike Santos aren't the only ones I've been keeping track of. There were 12 guys in your squad who made it home. Now there are 8. The implication hit me like a punch to the gut. He was telling me that 4 members of my old unit were dead, and that he was responsible. I asked, "What do you want?" trying to keep my voice steady. Tony smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. He said, "I want what you took from me, all of you. You came home when you shouldn't have. You got to live when better men died." I realized I was dealing with someone who was seriously unhinged, possibly suffering from some kind of military-related mental breakdown. I told him I needed to use the bathroom again, and this time he let me go. Instead of going to the bathroom, I slipped out the back exit of the bar and ran to my car. I locked the doors and immediately called 911, but when I tried to describe the situation to the dispatcher, I realized how crazy it sounded. A guy impersonating a dead soldier at a Memorial Day ceremony, claiming to have killed members of my old unit. Even I wasn't sure I believed it. I drove home and spent the rest of the night researching online, trying to find information about the guys from my squad. What I found confirmed my worst fears. David Kim had died in a car accident in Phoenix 6 months earlier. The accident report mentioned that his brake lines had been cut. Mike Torres, our radio operator, had been found dead in his apartment in Denver 3 months ago. The police had ruled it a suicide, but his family insisted he'd never shown signs of depression. I found 2 more deaths that fit the pattern. Both guys from my squad, both deaths that looked accidental or self-inflicted, but had details that didn't quite add up. 4 men, dead in less than 2 years. All of them from the same unit. All of them killed in ways that could be explained away as bad luck or personal problems. I called the local police the next morning and tried to report what had happened, but they weren't particularly interested. Without evidence of a specific crime, there wasn't much they could do. They took my statement and said they'd look into it, but I could tell they thought I was just a paranoid veteran seeing conspiracies where none existed. For the next few weeks, I was constantly looking over my shoulder. I changed my daily routines, started varying my route to work, and even bought a handgun for protection. I tried contacting the other surviving members of my squad, but most of them had moved on with their lives and didn't want to hear about some crazy conspiracy theory. Then, about a month after the Memorial Day encounter, I got a call from a detective in Colorado. Mike Torres's sister had been pushing for a more thorough investigation into his death, and they'd found something. Security footage from Mike's apartment building showed a man matching Tony's description, leaving the building on the night Mike died. The detective wanted to know if I could identify him. I told the detective everything that had happened, and suddenly my story didn't sound so crazy anymore. The FBI got involved, and they connected the fake Tony to similar incidents in other states. Apparently, he'd been targeting veterans from multiple units, always using the identity of someone who'd been killed in action. They never caught him. The investigation is still ongoing, as far as I know. But the trail went cold after Colorado. I've moved twice since then, and I don't attend Memorial Day ceremonies anymore. It's too dangerous, too easy for someone to approach you in that kind of crowd and setting. What haunts me most is not knowing why he chose our unit, or how many other guys he might have killed before I encountered him. The FBI thinks he might be a veteran himself, someone who snapped and decided that those of us who made it home didn't deserve to live. But they don't know for sure, and neither do I still think about the real Tony Mitchell sometimes, the one who died in Afghanistan and is buried at Arlington. I wonder what he'd think about someone using his name and identity to hunt down fellow veterans. It feels like a desecration of his memory on top of everything else. The 4 remaining members of my squad have all been contacted by law enforcement and warned about the potential threat. We keep in loose touch now, checking in on each other periodically. It's created a strange bond between us, knowing that someone out there wants us dead for the simple crime of surviving a war. Every Memorial Day since then, I stay home. I honor the fallen in my own way, privately, without the risk of being approached by someone pretending to be a brother in arms. Because I learned that day that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who knows exactly how to gain your trust.